Well, good afternoon and welcome to the third of four webinars exploring Muslim-Jewish relations in the United States. I'm Bob Silverman, AJC's Director of Muslim-Jewish Relations. I'm deeply appreciative of JCPA for creating this webinar series, which aims to support all of us in the field of Jewish community relations who are interested in grassroots Muslim-Jewish programming. Muslim-Jewish relations has always been a strategic priority for the Jewish people, and today's highly polarized nature of the public discourse on Islam and on Muslims in our country makes these relations all the more important. Thus, JCPA is doing a good service by providing Jewish leadership an online opportunity through this webinar to give a quick insight or two on the religion, ideals, sacred texts, and practices of Islam, as well as an insight into the contemporary Muslim experience in the U.S. It is our hope that this webinar series will give all of us some tools for beginning this timely and important work. In part one of this series, which is available online, Professor Reuven Firestone gave a primary on the history and contemporary practice of Islam. In part two, Imam Abdullah Antepli told us a bit about the American Muslim community, its four waves of immigration, starting with African-American Muslims brought to North America as slaves, and continuing into the recent refugee immigration that is occurring in the 21st century. Now, in part three, we will get to Muslim-Jewish tachlis, brass tacks, as they used to say, where rubber meets the road in Kartak. In other words, translating the theory of Muslim-Jewish relations into impactful programming. We will focus on grassroots best practices, and we will call on three experts in this field. And let me also, in this regard, preview the last of the four webinars, which will take place in April, and which will highlight the work of my friend Cheryl Olitsky, who is the founder of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, and she will talk about her own highly successful venture in Muslim-Jewish tachlis. Now, before I introduce our three speakers, JCPA asked me to also say a few words about AJC's Muslim-Jewish programming. It is focused on the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council, which is convened by AJC together with ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, in November 2016 as a national leadership coordination body. The council brings together business, political, nonprofit, and clergy leaders from all over the country to promote specific agreed upon public policy goals focused on a U.S. domestic agenda. Our main focus, our main public policy priority in the council is reversing the alarming rise in religious-based hate crimes in the U.S. We are promoting a bill in Congress called the Protecting Religiously Affiliated Institutions Act of 2017, a bill that passed overwhelmingly in the House by a vote of 402 to 2 in December and is now awaiting passage in the Senate. What does this bill do? It expands federal hate crimes protections to cover bomb threats and property damage to religious institutions that are not already covered by federal hate crimes laws. These include JCCs, religious schools. So it's a significant response to the rise in hate crimes. And we will provide subsequently, maybe tomorrow, to those who've registered some information about this bill, how you might contact your member of Congress to support its passage, particularly your senators. Now, the council also does media outreach and educational activities on the theory that you can't legislate away hate, and we can discuss that at a subsequent time. I would just add that there are 6 regional Muslim-Jewish advisory councils now, as well as the national one, all formed in the last year and a half, and they include areas like Philadelphia, New York City, Washington, D.C., Dallas, South Florida, and Los Angeles. and others are under formation. All of the regional councils, like the National Council, are explicitly advocacy groups on the theory that you get to know the other community by working together on common goals. And in the process, build the trust that allows you to address the sensitive intercommunal issues. And what are they? The ones we're working on and starting to address are anti-Semitism in the mosques in the US. And from the Muslim perspective, Jewish communal funding and support for what they perceive to be Islamophobic public figures in the US. So that is a very brief overview of AJC's contribution to Muslim Jewish Tachlis. Now let me introduce our three speakers and ask each of them to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions that you can write online, and I will take your questions, and we will have at least 20 minutes of back and forth on with our panelists. Our first panelist is David Brandwein. He is an environmental engineer and attorney, the immediate past president of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Hartford. David became involved in Muslim-Jewish relations through building Abrahamic Partnerships program of the well-known, world-famous Hartford Seminary. David is a co-founder of the Brunch Bunch, a now 5-year-old group of Muslim and Jewish couples who meet regularly in each other's homes and are planning a trip to Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan next month. Our second panelist is Diane Fisher. She is director of the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Silicon Valley. Restarting a folded JCRC in 2005, now 12 years later, the JCRC of the Silicon Valley is a vibrant partner across all kinds of interfaith and domestic policy arenas. In addition to facilitating a strong JCRC board, Diane leads the Teen Interfaith Leadership Council of Santa Clara County and the African American Jewish Partnership Project. Our final panelist, Rabbi Bob Kaplan, is the founding director of the Center for Community Leadership, a division of the JCRC of New York City, the central coordinating and resource body for 62 major Jewish organizations in the metropolitan New York area. Bob is involved with a wide variety of issues, including conflict resolution, coalition building, interracial, interreligious relationships, combating hate crimes, and community bridge building. On a personal note, when I came to New York a year and a half ago to start this job at AJC, Bob was my primary expert when it came to building bridges with the Muslim community of New York, and remains, as they say in the Shiite theology, a source of emulation, an ayatollah in this field. So, mixed metaphors. Now, I'm going to start with Diane and ask her to address best practices from her perspective in Muslim-Jewish relations. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I first want to just give kudos to the JCPA for putting together such great background presentations on Islam and the Muslim American community. So now I'm really ready to jump in and share two of my favorite Muslim Jewish programs that we've had here in Silicon Valley, and then just give you my personal advice on these, working on these relationships. So in 2015, our JCRC embarked on what was initially a study project, partnering with our local organization, Islamic Networks Group, which, by the way, has affiliate organizations in 15 other states, so you all may want to work with them as well. And we set out to find a way to share the Exodus story from both the Torah and the Quran. And I didn't know at the time, and possibly others are similarly unfamiliar, that Moses is the most frequently cited prophet in the Quran. The Quran was written with an assumption of familiarity with the Torah and the New Testament. So the entire Exodus story isn't repeated, but there are pieces of the story woven throughout the Quran. And just like for Jews, it's a central narrative for Muslims. There are also fundamental differences in the message and meaning of the story to Jews and Muslims. The Quranic story is more focused on the failure of Pharaoh to believe in something other than himself as divine, and thus he was dealt the plagues. But the Jewish story of redemption is clearly achieved at the hand of God, and our covenanted relationship begins at Exodus and later is sealed at Sinai. So for both Muslims and Jews, this is a story about our connection to God. And for both texts, Moses serves as a model for our responsibility for helping to redeem the world. So all of this is really fascinating to study together. Our study project began with a visit together with Islamic Networks Group staff to Zaytuna College in Berkeley. Zaytuna College is the first Muslim liberal arts college in the US. They welcomed their first freshman class in 2010. And we met there with a professor and a couple of students who were retained to pull every reference to Moses and the Exodus from the Quran. And this step was taken with Zaytuna to provide some authority to the process. And this is something I know that Imam Antepli mentioned in his presentation. This can be helpful since there really isn't an equivalent RAC or USCJ that provides a blessing on new ideas or interpretations. But once we had all of those references, the next step of what to do with this material was problematic. We didn't want to write Haggadah that just had some superficial references to the Quran. And we also weren't sure what some people might think of placing Torah and Quran references on the same page as if they were equivalent. So we came up with the idea of creating dramatic presentations on 3 different Exodus themes with parallel plays from the Torah and the Quran on each theme. And we wrote out the plays with dialogue lines, and we simply asked people to read the parts like a reader's theater. And the first play was about the interactions between Moses and Pharaoh, since their relationship illuminates the main message of the Exodus narrative. And the second play was about women of the Exodus story, the people who don't always get a lot of airtime, but without whom the story would not have happened. In the Jewish play, it was about Shifra and Miriam. And in the Muslim play, it was more about Asiya, Pharaoh's wife, who is said to have found the baby Moses rather than Pharaoh's daughter, as we tell it. The third play we did jointly, reenacting the actual crossing of the sea. And Chaya has a link to a great video which includes clips of the acting, which I commend to you to watch to get a sense of performing this. The second year we did this program, which by the way we called Halakha Seder. Halakha is an Arabic word that is a reference to a study circle. We took it up one notch and we recruited people to play the parts and then rehearse together with an actual drama coach. Which the rehearsal time then gave even more time for relationship building opportunities. And to this day, people say, "Hi, Moses," in Starbucks when they run into Sheldon, who played the part of Moses. This project has been packaged for implementation by any community, and Chaya has the links to the website where you can request the materials. And it includes table discussion questions for between the plays, and of course you would follow the plays with dinner. And I would recommend inviting members of the Muslim community who are generally in the same socioeconomic class as the Jewish participants. This is another thing that was mentioned by Imam Antepli in his presentation. The Muslim community is more divided along those socioeconomic lines than around religiosity like the Jewish community is. So if you have a group of Jewish professionals, seek out the same in the Muslim community. This program is in the category of mutual religious learning. It doesn't have anything directly to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict, but wherever your community is on the spectrum of Muslim-Jewish relations, whether experienced or novice, I really recommend doing this program because everyone will learn something from it, and it also sets the bar fairly high for discussion. We've had simpler events like a series of cooking classes where each community teaches the other how to prepare their favorite cultural dishes. And you can get interesting conversations over hummus, but this program really guarantees a substantive dialogue. The second program I wanted to highlight is for students, and it was called Coexistence Through Art. This one is bringing something from the Wayback Machine because honestly, we did it in 2007. And I know that because it took place the year of the Annapolis Peace Conference, the year when George W. Bush wanted to leave his mark on the Middle East peace process. And this program was a collaboration of a Jewish day school and a Muslim school, one class from each school, who were invited to create art about peace. At the time, the Museum on the Seam in Jerusalem, which is a privately funded socio-political contemporary art museum, which is probably closed at this point, they had an exhibit which famously inspired that popular coexist image, now found mostly on bumper stickers of old hippies. But the exhibit at the time could be borrowed for $100 in a poster format and included simple graphics on the theme of coexistence from artists around the world. So we shared those images with students and invited them to create their own art. So even though you can't get the coexistence poster set anymore, it seems particularly timely and worthwhile to revisit the concept, to invite young people to dream and to express themselves about coexistence and about peace in art. So we mounted all of the student artworks, displayed them on the walls of our JCC, and then we invited the parents and the students, Muslim and Jewish, to an evening program. We had some Muslim and Jewish artists speak first, and then the students went off to do some collaborative exercises and view each other's artwork on display and discuss with a facilitator. And the parents, who of course were more hesitant to participate, had their own session jointly facilitated by a rabbi and an imam. And Haya has also, for your use, the beautiful note card, which was a personal invitation that we sent to every family in the Muslim class to give it serious consideration. But really, with the current student leadership around the country that is kind of saying, blasting open the conversation and demand for action on gun violence, there is real reason to return to this kind of student programming as our hope for the future. There are many other models you might try, such as a speaker on moral issues like business ethics, joint service projects, book club readings, such as the title The Muslim Next Door by Sumbul Ali Karamali. You could attend professional theater productions together, but whatever you do, my main advice is always to have some structured conversation modeled on that World Cafe method, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, where you have small tables of 4 to 5 people, someone puts you at ease to start, and then you have a very specific topic to discuss, and at the end people are invited to share their insights with the group. I want to close with mentioning 3 overriding philosophies or principles that we have followed in building Muslim-Jewish relations. The first is that this is a person-by-person process. I am not a fan of building institutions or overly ambitious committees because the politics of these relations is so changeable. And sometimes hummus is just great, and other times you really have to talk about the elephant in the room, right? So you need to be flexible, and the only way to do that is to have real personal relations, people whose phone numbers are on your cell phone, that you can email on the weekend to work through something that's happened. Secondly, I don't advise having a litmus test for who you will speak with or sit with. I think it's especially the value added of JCRC to model open-mindedness and the idea that you don't have to agree with everything with someone in order to be in dialogue with them or to be on a panel with them. And my last advice is to be in this work for the long haul. This is a way of life. This is not a task force, but over time you will find that trust does happen. So good luck, and I'm glad we're all doing this together.
Thank you, Diane. Excellent overview of what's going on with the JCRC of the Silicon Valley, and I appreciate that. And now we're turning to our second panelist. He is David Brandwine. Take it away, David.
From snowy Connecticut. Diane concluded with talking about the importance of one-on-one and personal relationships, and that's sort of what I want to focus on during my few minutes. I want to start out with something that is fairly simple, something that my parents and their grandparents' generation often said, which was Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. In the Arabic, it's almost the same thing. It is Wassalam Alaikum and Salam Salam. I think it's really important when first creating and meeting somebody of the Muslim faith, it goes a long way towards offering that kind of greeting. If you can remember Shalom Aleichem, you can certainly remember Assalamu Alaikum. The American Muslim community, as Abdullah and Tepley mentioned in the last webinar, is perhaps the most diverse religious community in the United States. According to last year's Pew survey, about 60% are first generation, born in another country. Almost 80% are first or second generation. About 1/4 of American Muslims are African American, and about 3/4 are from Southeast Asia, the Levant, Europe, Africa, and so forth. And I think it's really helpful for those of us American Jews to remember that for immigrant American Muslims, their communities are about where we were and our families were about 2 to 3 generations ago. And to think along those lines when we are meeting those kinds of communities. Building any relationship starts with focusing on our commonalities, as we often say, our mutual interests, having empathy, listening to the other person. When we formed our brunch group almost 6 years ago, we started talking only about food, family, holidays, food, life cycle events, food, work-home relationships, and balance. It took us almost 2 years to get to the point where we were comfortable enough with each other that we could start talking about more difficult issues. Most people who are involved in this work recommend that you really need to form a relationship for a good 1 to 2 years at least before you start talking about politics and before you start talking about Israel. And I agree with that. You need to first talk about commonalities in practice and in ritual between Islam and Judaism. Things like kashrut and halal. We spent a lot of time when we were first coming to each other's houses trying to figure out what we could serve, what we could not serve, where it was okay to buy it from, how to greet each other, what kind of clothing was appropriate to wear, really basic interpersonal kinds of things. Especially, as I said, with regard to the immigrant American Muslim community, our parents and grandparents faced many of the same issues that the current Muslim community, other than the African American community, are facing now. While we first build on things that I talked about, like food, family, holidays, life cycle events, charity, the concepts are very similar. Birth and death rituals, which are very similar in terms of circumcision and also funerals and cleaning and caring for the dead. We found that some of the more interesting discussions then got into things like, how do we build our institutions? One of the things that we've been asked for up in our neck of the woods is to provide advice on how to build and fund houses of worship, religious schools, healthcare institutions, and community centers. For example, there's a growing need and interest in building mosques and Muslim community centers in our area, and I'm sure in most areas. And one of the questions we've been asked is, well, how did we initially fund JCCs? How did we initially fund synagogues? For many of the immigrant Muslim communities, they are not used to charging dues for attendance or membership in a mosque. It's a concept that's a bit foreign to them. And one of the things they're trying to understand is, how do we do it and how have we done it in the US? And that's been a really interesting discussion, sometimes among Jewish boards of directors and Muslim boards of directors with one-on-one discussions. In our community, we've been asked about things like dues versus voluntary contributions. What are the dues structures of our synagogues? We've explained sort of the balancing of having a due structure, whereas some synagogues are now going to try to get voluntary contributions and the pros and cons of that. What are our tools for fundraising? We've also had, and this is, I think, ripe for discussion, the pros and cons of religious day schools versus afternoon schools. Many of the Muslim mosques and community centers in our areas have a Sunday school. They're trying to increase the number of hours by having an afternoon school, but they're under the exact same pressures our Jewish community is. Another issue which we've discussed with them is because they are now raising American children with English language as their first language, how do they teach their children to pray in Arabic? How do you provide Arabic language lessons when you're only having a Sunday morning school or an afternoon school? Another topic for discussion is also intermarriage and dating. And these are one-on-one issues that we talk about in our brunches and other meetings. So there's a lot that can be discussed that has nothing to do with politics or with geopolitical concerns. Finally, one of the ways I found that is really useful to start a conversation with one person is to ask them to tell me about their growing up. Tell me about their religious education, what rituals did their family observe? And that usually then offers me an opportunity to share how I grew up, what my family observed, what kind of religious education I have. And then that leads into a conversation about how each tradition has different levels of observance, sometimes in the same family. And often we end up sort of laughing and commiserating about that. It's a conversation about our shared humanness. Finally, I just want to mention one potential resource that Chaya will include in the materials that I found useful, which is a publication of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, along with ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, called Sharing the Well, a resource guide for Jewish-Muslim engagement. It is available for free download on the jtsa.org website, and you'll get a link shortly. Just finally, I wanted to say, again, as I said at the beginning, that I think when meeting somebody, I have found that simply saying wassalamu alaikum to them and either shaking their hand or putting my hand over my heart goes a long way towards at least opening up some level of warmth in terms of a potential relationship. So I would encourage everybody to try to remember to do that. And finally, I would say Baruch Hashem, or in the words of our friend, that great rabbinic sage, Abdullah Antepli, Baruch Allah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Now our third and final panelist is Rabbi Bob Kaplan. Please feel free while he's talking to send any and all questions, because as soon as we're finished with Bob's presentation, we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Bob.
So thank you very much. And I really want to thank Diane and David for laying down a very firm foundation. And I really want to second and triple all the things that you said. And it's appropriate that I'm going last, because we do not do specific. It's not that we haven't engaged in work of Muslim-Jewish relations. We don't do specific Muslim-Jewish relation programs. Similarly, we don't do Black Jewish, we don't do Latino Jewish or others. We try to engage the entire community, and New York, as many places, is an incredibly diverse place in a process of a shared society. And that has been sort of our goal and our hallmark since we began our work shortly after the riots in Crown Heights in the summer of 1991. Our job then was to look at how we were going to prevent conflict, and by bringing together people in a trusting relationship, or to building trusting relationships around issues of commonality and building a shared society, it's really allowed us to learn that well. If you look over one of my shoulders, so we're looking in the mirror there, you'll see a picture of Smokey the Bear, and Smokey's always been my guru in saying that it's easier to prevent a forest fire than putting one out. However, all that being said, we have engaged with the Muslim community in New York, and as has been pointed out in previous presentations, it is an incredibly diverse community with very different postures and periods of time in the context of New York and different communities in New York. We began our work a long time ago with building coalitions around healthcare. And by building coalitions around healthcare, we one of our early coalitions, the Greater Southern Brooklyn Health Coalition, we actually brought on someone to be our original director. Her name is Fatima Shama. Fatima eventually became the Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs of the City of New York. We met her early on when the Arab American Family Support Center was being founded in the early 90s. However, in the work that we did around healthcare, we didn't always talk about the issues. We developed cultural competency. We developed new ways of bringing healthcare into communities. However, 3 or 4 hours after the planes hit the buildings on 9/11, I get a phone call from Amira Habibi Brown, the executive director of the Arab American Family Support Center, asking some really tough questions. The tough questions were, what do we do with women wearing hijab, and how do they walk around the streets of New York after this has happened? And what do we do about our building? And we had to have some tough conversations. But mirroring what was said before, it's because we had relationships in place. We understood each other and respected each other, and understood that we stood on some very different lines around other kinds of issues. Were we able to ask those kinds of questions? Another example of the kinds of integration into the community is another organization that we developed deep relationships with following 9/11 is an organization that started off initially as the Council of Pakistan Organizations, now known as the Council of People's Organizations, headed by a fellow named Muhammad Razvi, Mo. Mo and I are very deep friends, and we've done a number of things together, like founding a coalition in Brooklyn called We Are All Brooklyn. Again, the full diversity of Brooklyn, working on hate crimes together, working on a number of things together. Mo has been to Israel with me 3 times. State Department, working in mixed cities. Mo is a major leader now in the Muslim community. However, a number of years ago, I walked into his organization and I noticed there was a lot of seniors there. So I asked him, why do you have all these seniors here? And it was very simple. The community had gone through a change. The younger folks who had lived in the community initially had either aged out or moved out. There was a lot of seniors left behind, and there was no Muslim senior center where they could go and speak the language and live the life and certainly eat South Asian halal food, and Mo had created one. Well, one of the things he needed was Meals on Wheels. And the contract for Meals on Wheels in his area belonged to an organization called JASA, the Jewish Association for Services to the Aged. We began to build a relationship between JASA and COPO. It wasn't always an easy thing to do. There was lots of obstacles in the way. However, today, 7 years after we began to build that relationship, JASA, and in cooperation with COPO, is now delivering halal South Asian meals to Muslim families through COPO, and developing that kind of real relationship about how do we share resources on a localized level. So when stuff happens in that community, there are real relationships between and it happens with that particular community of Flatbush, of Midwood. There are approximately a couple of 100,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews, almost 100,000 ultra-Orthodox Muslims, sometimes a very combustible type of relationship. However, the relationship is there. And when things happen in the world or things happen in the community, the partnership is there to be able to move that forward in a more comfortable way. Another process that we became engaged in and then handed off to another organization, and that's really our modus operandi. We begin to incubate things and then look for partners in the community that could take it to its necessary local and next stage. Walked into another mosque headed by a friend of mine. His name is Sheikh Musa Drama. It's up in the Bronx. Musa is an African imam. The African Muslim community in New York numbers in the hundreds of thousands. And it happened to be during Ramadan. I went to go visit him, and he's showing me around his Islamic school and his mosque. And here was the classrooms, and here was the prayer room, and here was the synagogue. So I looked at Musa and I said to him, have you been fasting a little bit too much? What do you mean a synagogue? Opens the door and there's a huge picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe standing there looking me in the face, and he began to tell me a story. The neighborhood which he lives in and had the place in had once upon a time been a very large Jewish community. However, Jews had moved. synagogues had closed up, and there was now a number of older Jews living in the community that needed a place to pray. And sure enough, he gave them a place to pray. Chabad came in with a rabbi, and they had a synagogue in a mosque. So we contacted the local Riverdale Y. We contacted Manhattan College being a Catholic college. And together, they brought together young people in the community to come in, do some work, do some fixing up, do some dialogue. And this is now an ongoing project owned by a local synagogue, Tehillah, owned by the Riverdale Y, funded by UJ Federation, and of course, Manhattan College and their Holocaust and Genocide Studies Department, headed by a very unique human being. Her name is Manaza Afridi, who is the chair of their Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a Pakistani Muslim woman. It's this kind of work that allows us to look at commonality in a community, to look at these kinds of opportunities of building a shared society together, like I said, that has developed multiple points of entry and connectivity with the Muslim community throughout New York. And when we see that folks, and because of limited capacity, because of limited bandwidth sometimes on the part of JCRC, we don't see ourselves as always being the initiator, then how do we become a partner? And if we see something happening, how do we find a local partner in a community to be able to take it to the next stage? We now have literally dozens of deep relationships, long-term relationships with the Muslim leadership of New York. But more important than that is that there are now, well, a number of organizations, perhaps a dozen or more, Jewish organizations in communities that are now running these kinds of projects, doing amazing work with the Muslim community on a localized level and around the very things that have been mentioned before, or things around quality of life issues, such as soup kitchens and other kinds of opportunities to take care of the community at large. It's by building these kinds of long-term relationships that, well, when something happens, we're able to step into it and make sure that we can allow it from exploding or getting out of control in the context of our community. I see that my 10 minutes is about up, so I'm really looking forward to the questions that will come after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kaplan. So let's move to a couple questions, and people feel free to continue writing them in, and I will relay them to our panelists. Let me start out with a question for all three of you. This question is, for us novices, can you provide one or two first steps in this engagement that will lead to meaningful relationships? Let's start with, let's just go in the same order. Let's start with Diane. One or two first steps.
David talked a lot about the personal, welcoming kinds of things. Maybe I'll address more sort of who do you invite? Like if the first step is to think about how do you do the outreach? I think Imam Antepli also spoke a lot about how the Turkish community that he is a part of is sort of what he described as low-hanging fruit. There are, in general, if you're looking at the South Asian community, the Turkish community, the Ahmadiyya community, there are a number of Muslim communities with which we don't end up having to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's an easier place to start with building relationships. But you need to know your own community. As we were saying, there's such diversity. Those are the groups that we started with in our community, particularly like women's groups at the Ahmadiyya Center, doing a number of programs where we spoke about common issues around fasting and community service. So I think that's one recommendation I can give, is to just find those communities where you don't have conflict to start with.
Dave, thank you.
I would just say if you run into somebody that you would like to get to know a little bit better and learn about their community, whether it's at a business organization, a social function, in the grocery store, wherever, just ask them if they would go out and have coffee or tea with you sometime, and ask them to, you want to learn more about them and about their community. I found most people are very happy and want to tell you about their community, about themselves.
Thank you, Bob.
One of the most important things we do in community organizing overall is do your homework. You know, Reuven Firestone, right in the beginning, talked about his book. Read his book. Get a real idea about who the Muslim community is so you're not working in a void. And then the most important thing is work on yourself to develop a true sense of cultural competency and cultural humility, so that when you listen to the other, you can begin to understand that their narrative is as valid and as important and as motivating and as passionate to them as yours is to you. So that when you engage with them, you have that as a set point. So we're not always looking at that litmus test. We're not always looking at only through our Jewish lens at these processes. When I learned from Mo that seniors are important, that was my openness to understand that seniors are important. I never would have thought of that, but I allowed him to be my teacher, and allowing the other to be your teacher is a very powerful moment.
Thank you. Another question focused on Bob. Okay, so one panelist said we shouldn't use litmus tests, and I agree. But if we do not use litmus tests, what do we do about the fundamentalist Islamicists, the people that we have so little in common with, but yet are part of that other community and want to join in a dialogue with you? What do you do?
So, you know, you can't say, man, personally, I can't say I can't use a litmus test. There are certain lines that if someone is supporting terrorism, if someone is vehemently anti-Israel in really, really nasty ways, there are litmus tests that I hold personally. By the way, I use that for lots of different things that I do. I mean, it's not just in the Muslim community. Litmus tests are used for everything what we do and who we engage with. It's sort of understanding also how you engage. So some folks you got to engage, and not always necessarily out in the open. I talk to lots of different folks that if I talk to them out in the open, it could be very problematic. Sometimes the processes are out in the open with folks that are just a little bit more easy to work with sometimes. However, you always have to know where your moral lines are and your moral compass is. And if you don't follow that rule, then you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble just trying to be friendly with a lot of folks that are out there. Let the police do what the police do, and let the FBI does what the FBI does with terrorists and other kinds of folks. You don't got to make friends with everyone. You got to make friends with people who have the same goal of building a shared society together. And the other kinds of folks, well, that's a little bit more nuanced.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, here's a question for Diane. Let me just read it. As both Jewish and Muslim communities are facing issues of funding for our aging community members and threatened cuts to our Medicaid and Medicare, do you think we should be working together with Muslim counterparts in lobbying federal and state levels to support aging members?
Are you sure that wasn't a question for Bob? Because that's what you talked about, right? Healthcare?
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, Bob, we can go to you too.
Yeah, but you shouldn't only be working with Muslims. You should be working with Koreans. You should be working with Chinese. You should be working with everyone in a society. Matter of fact, when we found out that Meals on Wheels, that the city was giving $5 per meal for the classic meal, that it cost $1.50 more for a kosher meal, approximately the same for a halal meal, and the same for a Korean type meal. We put all of them three together, got them all in the room. They did what they needed to do. They went and lobbied with the city council, and guess what? They got $1 extra. They got $1 extra, so they only had to raise 50 cents. These kinds of issues of sharing resources, the inability to share resources, the inability to play in the sandbox is the primary cause for conflict. The ability to teach people and to have people share resources on a localized level, not get into conflict, is the way to build a shared democracy and a shared society.
Thank you. Here's a question for all three. It imagines an hypothetical, bad hasva halila scenario. Let's say there is another Gaza crisis, so that there are rockets now raining down in Israel, and there's retaliation airstrikes happening in Gaza. How does that impact what you do at the local level, or how would you manage that crisis situation? Starting with David. Let's start with David.
Well, obviously that has happened. In fact, when the Gaza incursion happened, I guess it was 2 or 3 summers ago, actually it was right in the middle of Ramadan that summer. And our couples group, which had then been meeting for about 2 years, had never talked about politics. I also need to caution that that particular group is not made up of Middle Eastern or Arabic Muslims. It's all Southeast Asian, Turkish, and so forth. So there's a little bit different dynamic. But they still were being bombarded on Facebook and with tweets and so forth from all over the world with very negative information. And one of them just called us up and said, it's now been 2 years, we haven't talked about this. Would you come over to our house for an iftar? And afterwards, can we talk about it? So we did, and we were there till about 2 in the morning. If we hadn't had that relationship, we never would have gotten to that point. And from that, we then had a retreat later and talked about it. But I think so much of this is building the relationship and fixing misconceptions of Jews in the Muslim community and of Muslims in the Jewish community. Most of the Muslims I've encountered have always learned that the creation of the State of Israel was almost solely a response to World War II and the Holocaust. They really don't have much knowledge of the 2,500-year-old history of the Jews to the land. And we're very surprised at that, which surprised me. So I think you really have to sort of build the relationships. And also, there are people you're not going to be able to talk to. I mean, we have had Muslims in our community, and we're primarily a suburban community, or suburban community surrounding the inner city of Hartford. We've had Muslims who say they will not talk to us, they will not talk to me, because I am a representative of the JCRC and the Federation, which is a Zionist entity, and they won't speak to Zionist entities. There's nothing you can do about that. You can try as hard as you can, but at some point, you've got to move on.
Right. Thank you. Diane, how would you respond to that scenario that I laid out?
Yeah, I always say for JCRC work that you go where the door opens, right? I mean, as David just said, there are people you can't talk to, and if the door is closed, the door is closed. There are plenty of other places where the door is open, and so you go there. But I just want to say that it doesn't necessarily have to only be, and certainly a lot of times it is, as David said, the South Asian community that you can continue speaking with or something like that. Or maybe things actually take a hiatus for a while during particularly bad times. But I just want to share an amazing experience I had. If people remember when Mohammed Abu Khadr was burned, and that was like a huge, just horrific crisis in the community. Some of his relatives were living right here in Los Gatos down the street from our JCC. And through our relationships with people that we have in the Muslim community, 2 rabbis and myself made a connection with those family members, and it was during Ramadan, and we were able to visit them in the evening and bring the rabbi's book about Torah of Reconciliation as a copy and sit and have some tea and speak with each other. And there were a lot of things that were unspoken, but it was our humanity that was shared in that moment with people you might not ever have expected you could sit in the living room with and share those feelings of sadness. So you just never know, is all I'm saying. You can give it a try.
Thank you, Dan. Bob.
So I want to echo what has been said already. Having the relationships in place are extremely important because, frankly, it happens and it has happened in the past, and probably, God forbid, we know that things like this more than likely will happen again in the future. Similarly, during the last, well, not the last Gaza war, the one before that, we were working on a coalition around aging in Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. We had a conference around the issue during one of the days of the war, and a leader in the Arab Palestinian community comes walking in, somebody who a lot of people know in this country, and looks at me, and I look at that person, and her organization is really going after Israel. JCRC is defending Israel. Looks at me and says, you know something? We have a conference to do today. Neither one of us are going to solve the problem in the Middle East right here. Let's move this on. I'm not saying that person is always so nice and always so genteel about the process, but I think that the humanity of the moment of helping other people and building a shared society together really overcame a very, very difficult process. I think we're going to have to handle each and every one of these incidents in the future in a very individualistic way, and we're going to have to really do some real hard work in continuing to build these relationships on a localized level. One thing I want to echo is something that David said, is that his population is primarily South Asian. Remember, we're not talking about a monolithic community that has the same level of engagement in the issues in the Middle East. When I talk to the African community, there's one level of engagement. The South Asian community, another level of engagement. When you talk to the Palestinian community in Brooklyn, well, it's a whole other level of engagement. These are all different levels of engagement. So to be fully understanding and recognize that we have internal diversity in the Jewish community, we're all different, and sometimes we don't get along, happens there too.
Thank you. And in fact, I think you just answered another question that was very specifically said, Rabbi, would you meet with Linda Sarsour, an open Islamicist? Probably the person that you just were referring to. So
I know Linda for many, many years. We have done work together in the past around certain things. We don't agree about a whole lot. It's a very difficult question and a very nuanced answer.
okay. Let me ask the other two. We have another question that's less New York centric. It says, if one is from a small community where there is one synagogue and one mosque, so that's not New York City, Bob, what would, that is closer, is not even Silicon Valley or Hartford, but it's closer. And so what would you recommend in those smaller communities that has one mosque and one synagogue? David?
So that's a great question, and I think small. If that synagogue has a men's club or a sisterhood, maybe have that organization call up the mosque and say, you know, what we found is Sunday mornings are probably the best time to meet. They normally meet often on Friday nights or Saturday nights before Shabbos is over. Sunday mornings may be difficult family-wise, but Sunday seems to be the best time. Say, you know, could we do a joint program, or would your imam come over to our synagogue, or could I, Rabbi, come over to your synagogue and talk about something together? The kinds of things that we have seen have been really fascinating are having a Jewish funeral director and a Muslim imam talk about death and burial practices, talking about kashrut and halal. There are a number of subjects where synagogues and mosques can do one-on-one things. Musical programs can often work, as long as you try to stay away from the political aspects of the musical programs. So there's a lot of stuff. And again, I would refer people to the Sharing the Well brochure that JTS and ISMA did a few years ago, because they've got a number of examples of things that people around the country, especially in smaller communities, have tried.
Okay, Diane, thoughts on the smaller communities?
I definitely commend the program I talked about of acting out the Exodus stories from the Quran and the Torah. The second time we did that, it was at a synagogue, and it's been repeated at a number of synagogues in the Bay Area. So that's a great one. Ramadan is coming up in May this year, and people, hospitality is a key piece of that experience. So that would be, you know, just participating in that, you know, connecting with people. It depends. You really have to know the mosque, right? Because maybe the imam is someone who doesn't speak English, and the leadership of the mosque is, you know, other folks in the community that are leading. So sort of doing some homework, I think, as Rabbi Bob mentioned, you know, do your homework and find out who is there and who you can connect with. And that's actually a really great way to start, is just between.
I would just like to second that. With Ramadan coming up, go to the website of the mosque, assuming they have a website, and often they will have an announcement inviting the community to an iftar, to a meal or two. And then instead of just showing up, call up and say, you know, we've got some members of our community who would like to come. They would love to have you.
Good thought. Good thought.
Ramadan and Passover are both great sharing opportunities.
And I'll just throw in another suggestion for those in the smaller communities that public policy advocacy works too, and at the local level. If you're in one of the 5 states that doesn't have a hate crimes law, Indiana, South Carolina, Georgia, are 3 of them, where there are Jewish communities, significant ones, you can team up with Muslims. That's a common ground issue. Refugee resettlement, often a common ground issue. And there are other issues too. So find a common ground political issue that you want to work on with them, domestic focus, and find ways to work together. Another question, this is more of a factual one, and we can do very quickly with it. How do Muslims, you talked about the diversity, and here's the question about the Ahmadiyya. Should they be brought in, Ahmadiyya, into a Muslim engagement strategy? Bob?
Well, it's interesting because we run a fellowship in New York called Women in Faith, and women, intergenerational, professional women where faith is an important issue in their lives. We have both what you call classic Muslims and Ahmadiyya as well. You know, the Ahmadiyyas in New York, they have their own mosque, they have their own community, and like anybody else, they got to deal with them. Do they get along with the rest of the community? The rest of the community with them? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I'm actually surprised when they do show up at other larger Muslim type of gatherings. You got to know how a community feels and operates. We can't force things in our own community. Don't try and force them in anybody else's community either.
Good advice. Anyone else? Diana, you want to jump in? No. Yes?
Yeah, so we definitely did a lot of work, particularly amongst women with the Ahmadiyya community here. And it was an interesting process. I think the mainstream Muslim and Jewish relations kind of facilitated a bridging with the Ahmadiyya community and the Muslim community. So at some point, you know, fundraisers for the Muslim community would have a table of the Ahmadiyyans and a table of the Jews, and we were actually the friends closer there too, but we were helping bridge some of those gaps in the community as well. So it's also one of those things that takes time.
Yeah, I would just add, for mainstream Muslims, Ahmadiyya are outside the religion because they have a prophet after Muhammad. They consider themselves Muslims. As Bob said, many Muslim groups see them as interfaith partners. So they, I'd recommend being sensitive to how they're viewed by the mainstream Muslim groups.
Sort of like the LDS Church to Christians.
Or like Jews for Jesus, among other Jews. Jews for Jesus consider themselves Jews. Other Jews do not, because they accept Jesus as the Messiah. And similarly, there's this guy called Ahmed, who is the name of the Ahmadiyya, who's a prophet for the Ahmadiyya Muslims after Muhammad. Well, I'm going to wrap up because we're now at 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, for this session. Focus on best practices. And there were a lot of great ideas. I want to thank our 3 panelists from diverse communities from the West Coast, from medium-sized communities on the East Coast to the largest Jewish community in the world, New York City, and the largest Muslim community in the Western Hemisphere, New York City. So thank you all. And let's stay tuned for the 3rd and final panel focused on the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom in April. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.